So welcome everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Chana Polim of the Jonah Goldrich Institute for Yiddish Language, Literature and Culture at Tel Aviv University. And it is a wonderful, incredible honor to start our conference, to welcome you, Bruchim Aboim. This is Yiddish and the Holocaust, New Approaches. It's an honor to have the research of so many talented scholars from all over the world presented in our conference. And I want to start with a special thanks to the conference committee, Sven-Eric Rose, Katarzyna Persson, Stephen Neron, and Dominic Williams. This has been a completely collaborative effort. And of course, Jovita Panchik, my wonderful student who has contributed along the way. When Sven-Eric, Katarzyna, Stephen, Dominic, and I started planning this conference nearly 2 years ago, we did so as an act of kin-making and of scholarly passion. This was kin-making because we noticed that scholars from all over the world were working on Yiddish sources related to the Holocaust and were asking similar questions and looking at similar sources without always knowing that they were. We wanted to make those deep research connections explicit and also to humanize those connections, to invite us all to come into some kind of room together, even a virtual room, and recognize that we have a field here and that we have a we here. This was also an act of scholarly passion because we believe that it is time to expand and elevate the place of Yiddish texts in Holocaust studies. Perhaps a few lines from Avram Sutzkever's poem, Verfrorene Jiden, Frozen Jews, can help illustrate what we mean by that. Hast du gesehen über Felder mit Schnee, verfrorene Jiden, array noch array? Schieper über etliche Strophes, und es gliefert der Fäust bei nacktem Greis und kennt nicht sein Koech befreien von Eis. And in Barbara and Benjamin Harshav's English translation, those verses read, "Did you ever see in fields of snow frozen Jews in rows upon row? The fist of a naked man in surprise, he cannot release his force from the ice." When Sutzkever wrote this poem in 1944 in Moscow, he feared that, much like the rest of the world, he was losing touch with the specific humanity of the dead that he had left behind in his hometown of Vilna. That is, everyone knew that there were millions, or would know very soon, that there were millions of people who had been killed by the Nazis, but those dead individuals were already becoming frozen icons of victimhood, symbols, numbers, talking points, rather than complex, intelligent cultural agents of their own right. We wanted this conference to chip away from the ice that surrounded the old man's fist, to enable the East European Jewish communities destroyed in the Holocaust to release their own intellectual and creative forces. In other words, this conference aims to try to tap into the etik, or the indigenous knowledge of those Yiddish-speaking worlds that witnessed the Nazi genocide. Looking at the incredibly rich lineup of papers we have in this conference, and we are so honored to have you, I am very optimistic that we will make strides towards that goal. When we started planning this conference, we of course could not have known that it would take place in the midst of a prolonged, horrendous war between Israel and Hamas, one that started with the massacres on October 7th and has since taken the lives of tens of thousands of innocent people, Israelis and Palestinians, and is currently keeping civilians and innocents hostage as we speak, and has hurt many lives of those present here on a very personal level, myself included. Though this current war is not the topic of our conference, we cannot help but confront this reality. In that spirit, we have added a session on Monday with 2 leading journalists who will help us discuss and learn about the war together. And I hope you'll join us for that. But beyond that specific window of discussion, I do think that the underlying themes, voices, and stories of this conference speak to our current crisis on many levels. And I know that different people participating in this conference and listening to this conference at home, since there's another link where there's some other people who are listening in, so it goes beyond the people who are with us here in this conference participant room. I know that people will see these connections on different levels, and that diversity of opinion and approach and background is a positive, in my opinion. For me, studying the Holocaust through Yiddish is about getting beyond the cliched icons of victimhood, the slogans, the universal metaphors, and hashtags, and illuminating the ways that victims present themselves in their own words. This is about listening deeply to a voice from another culture, language, time, and place. That is, I am the descendant of Yiddish-speaking Jews, but that's not the language that in which I lead my daily life. And so for me, studying these materials is an encounter with difference, and letting that voice, letting that language rearrange my conceptions of survival, torment, power, and powerlessness. Ultimately, I think that the work of studying Yiddish Holocaust sources teaches us about the possibilities of radical empathy on personal, scholarly, and cultural levels. Thank you all so much again for being here. I now pass the microphone on to my colleague and friend, Professor Sven Eric Rose of UC Davis.
Hello, everyone. I'm realizing that my Wi-Fi is a little bit dodgy. I thought I had my Ether cable correctly set up, and I'm afraid I don't. So I'm going to check on that in a moment. I hope that this goes okay. Thank you so much, Hannah. And it's nice to see all of you. The field of Holocaust studies has evolved over decades without, until relatively recently, concerning itself centrally with the experience of the victims. A well-respected and prolific Holocaust scholar recently referred in conversation with me to Yiddish as, quote, one of the obscure languages of Holocaust studies, end quote. My point is not to call out or try to embarrass this deservedly respected scholar, but rather to use their comment to show how peripheral Yiddish is still seen to be in the field by some of its well-regarded and institutionally well-positioned practitioners. Yiddish, however, can be seen as of minor importance only from within a framework that regards the quote-unquote real history of the Holocaust to be the history of the acts and deliberations of its perpetrators. From such a perspective, what is paramount about the 6 million Jewish victims is their death. And the language of the dead is, of course, silence, which I might add, conveniently doesn't require years of study to learn. Translates really well as well. Yet when we approach the Holocaust as the catastrophe its victims experienced, as a catastrophe for individual and collective Jewish life in Europe, then the languages Jews spoke and lived in they become vital, and the place of Yiddish among those languages takes on capital importance. Listening to Yiddish sources opens unique doors to how victims thought through and tried to negotiate the events of the Holocaust as they were unfolding, and how many survivors thought about and memorialized them after the fact. The attention to Yiddish and dominant strains of Holocaust studies has left a hole at the center of the field. I by no means want to minimize the extraordinary Holocaust studies scholarship that has focused on Yiddish, work done not least by many participants in this conference, but rather to say that work based on Yiddish sources remains something of a niche within the wider field of Holocaust studies. To scholars with no access to Yiddish, it can seem, in a word, obscure. There is an obvious danger in this. Academic fields evolve and move on from what come to be perceived as old questions. And such dynamism is vitally important, and the turn to comparison in Holocaust studies and to multidirectionality in the memory of the Holocaust, together with other historical traumas, is entirely welcome. However, the wish to move beyond what are perceived to be exhausted paradigms tends to presume that those paradigms were themselves, in fact, exhaustive. They weren't. My hope is that new departures in Holocaust studies can go hand in hand with new approaches to the study of the overlooked lives, thoughts, and speech of Holocaust victims. If not, so many Jewish voices, long neglected by the most influential treatments of the Holocaust, will once again be effectively silenced, ostensibly moved on from, without, in fact, ever having been attended to in the first place. The exhilarating group of international scholars assembled for this conference on Yiddish and the Holocaust, New Approaches, are working precisely at the seam of scholarly innovation and attention to sources and questions that have been relatively and often egregiously overlooked. It is particularly meaningful to me and I imagine to many of you, to be working with scholars from East and West Europe, North and South America, and Israel. Our shared future depends on continuing to talk to, not silencing or boycotting each other. I thank each of you so much for being here. I also want to express special gratitude to Hannah Palingalai for her extraordinary efforts under, to say the least, difficult circumstances to make this conference happen, to not let it not happen. And we all owe you a great debt of gratitude, Hannah. And also want to thank you for inviting me to collaborate with you on it. With Hannah, I thank the whole conference committee, as Stephen Nerone, Katarzyna Persson, and Dominic Williams. We wish especially to thank the Goldrich Institute and the Goldrich family, Vered Sagi for the administrative director of the Goldrich Institute, the Fortunov Archive for Holocaust Testimony at Yale, the Department of Literature at Tel Aviv University, and Jovita Panchik, Hannah's wonderful doctoral student who threw her whole heart and soul into making this happen. Jovita was simply extraordinary and all of the preparation for this conference. So thank you all so much.
I'll be brief so we can move on to the actual conference. I just wanted to also say thanks to Hannah and Sven Erik for what they just said. The last 9 months have been shaken us, I think, all of us deeply, personally and professionally. And I just want to again thank you two in particular, but as well Kasia and Dominic, for showing really enormous amount of strength and conviction during these times to make sure that this conference happens despite all of the challenges that that you all faced, we all faced. Davka, it seems that that the state of the world, it makes it all the more important for us to get together, even if it is online, and discuss the vitality and the resilience of Yiddish culture, Jewish culture, in particular, its response to catastrophe, both distant and present. Of course, I'm sad that we can't be together physically as intended, but I've assured Hannah that this is not the last time that the Fortunov Video Archive plans to support an event of this kind on this topic. It seems self-evident to me that we should do that. After all, the testimonies of the survivors given at the Fortunov Video Archive are filled with Yiddish language, fragments of Yiddish culture destroyed by the war. They both contain Yiddish sources and they are Yiddish sources for Holocaust research. So the archive will certainly continue to support this type of engagement in the future. And I think it's obvious, as Hannah also said, that the response to the call for papers was so strong, as you can see from this impressive conference program, that I can imagine a need for a regular conference on this topic to accommodate not just the usual suspects, who we are very happy to see, but also the sort of ever-growing Nachwuchs of Yiddish urban forschers who are inundated us with fascinating paper proposals. So with that, I would just like to add my voice to the others here today, yearning for better times and with the hope that this conference will be a productive one. And thank you all on this call for participating.
Wonderful. So I can see now that the general public has been invited into our Zoom, so we'll let them join us and we'll begin with our first session. I have just a few practical announcements. Each session we're going to try to run on time. I see we're already 4 minutes late, so we'll just shorten that. The way that discussions will happen in this conference is that each of you are invited to submit your questions in the chat while people are speaking or immediately afterwards, and then it'll be up to the moderator to call on you. And so now we'll begin the session on what is Churban Yiddish? As I started to say, please type your questions in and the moderator will call on you to discuss. This is a pre-recorded session, so the pre-recorded sessions will be very dialogic. You're invited to join us to discuss. And please have your camera on when you talk. And since the general audience is in the same Zoom as the speakers this time, you can do the same thing, and further sessions will give you other directions. All right, let's get this show on the road. Pass it on to Sven Erik Rose, please.